They didn't leave us recordings. Not a single one. No cylinders. No reels. No forgotten archives hiding in some dusty cathedral. They left ink. That's it. Ink on parchment. Thin, hand-cut vellum. Music written by hand. Or more often, not written at all. That's the part people forget. Most of it was never written. We think of music as something permanent now, something that lasts. Once recorded, it's preserved. But in the medieval world, music was closer to weather, something that moved through you, something that happened once, and then it was gone. The first time I saw a medieval chant, I didn't realize what I was looking at. I was 19, an undergraduate. It was part of a facsimile set, reproductions of medieval manuscripts for study. I thought they were just poems at first. Latin text arranged in careful columns, illuminated letters, occasional gold leaf if the scribe was feeling fancy. It looked more like decoration than instruction. Then I noticed the marks. Tiny black lines, curves, hooks, floating above the words. That was the notation. They're called neumes, the earliest form of European musical notation. But they're not notes in the way we understand them now. There's no rhythm written down, no exact pitch, no staff lines in most cases. Just gentle guides, a suggestion of how the melody should rise and fall. They weren't made to teach someone the chant from scratch. You already had to know the tune. The neumes just reminded you. So what happened if no one remembered? The music disappeared. This is why we've lost so much of it. It's not that people didn't care about music. They did. Music was essential. To prayer, to ceremony, to memory. It's just that the technology to preserve it hadn't caught up. The printing press wouldn't arrive until the 15th century. Audio recording wouldn't show up for another 400 years after that. So they used their voices. And their memory. One singer passed a melody to another. One teacher to a student. One monk to his choir. And when that chain broke, when someone forgot or died or stopped teaching, the song broke with it. We have surviving manuscripts, precious ones. Most are from monasteries, especially Benedictine ones, which kept orderly libraries and treated their music as sacred text. The music we have from that time is overwhelmingly liturgical. Mass settings, vespers, processional hymns. It's beautiful, but it's only a fraction. There were other songs, folk songs, love songs, work songs, laments, lullabies. Very few of those were preserved. Not because they weren't good, not because they weren't loved. They just didn't make it into the scriptorium. Even in the monasteries, survival was uneven. A chant might survive in one book, but be missing a page. A margin might show a correction or alternative phrasing. Sometimes we find a melody written with no text, or text with no melody. In some cases, we find records of chants that were widely known in their time, but the actual music has vanished. We know the names, not the notes. We know the titles, not the sound. One of the best examples is the Cambridge Songs, a collection of Latin and German songs from the 11th century. They were written in a manuscript stored in Cambridge University Library. But in the 19th century, a leaf, a single page, was removed. Quietly, no one noticed right away. There was no alarm. Just an empty place where music used to be. That page didn't return for over 140 years. It surfaced in the United States, in a private collection. Someone recognized it for what it was, a missing piece of medieval music history, and returned it. Just one page, but it was enough to complete a broken cycle, enough to finish melodies that had been half-guessed for generations, enough to hear the song properly for the first time in a century and a half. That's the part that stays with me. Not the loss, the recovery. The idea that music can wait, that a melody can survive in silence, that even when a song goes unheard for 500 years, it can still come back. You just need someone who's listening. I think about that every time I hear reconstructed music performed, not from recordings, but from live careful study. Musicians today use those old manuscripts, those partial fragments, those faded notations, and they listen to them. They interpret, they make decisions. They fill in the blanks, not to guess, but to get close, to honor what was there and what almost disappeared. The result is haunting. Not because it's eerie, but because it feels like memory. It doesn't sound like modern music. It isn't built on chords the way we're used to. There's no beat, no hook, just line after line of smooth melodic thought. Simple, slow, and intentional. You don't follow it. You settle into it. It doesn't push you forward. It holds you in place. People often ask what medieval music sounds like. The honest answer is, we'll never know exactly. But we can get close. Close enough to hear what they might have heard. Close enough to feel the shape of a song that almost vanished. Close enough to know it was never truly lost, just waiting. It doesn't start with a melody. It starts with a mark. A curved line, no thicker than a thread, hanging above a Latin word in a 900-year-old manuscript. A neume. Maybe 2, maybe 4. They don't look like notes. Not to us, but to someone in the 11th century, they meant sound, they meant music. Reconstructing medieval music is slow work, not romantic, not glamorous. Mostly quiet hours spent with magnified scans of parchment, Latin dictionaries, music theory texts, and educated guesses. You don't discover a chant. You piece it together, a syllable at a time. Let's say you're a scholar looking at a 12th century manuscript. You find a chant. The Latin you can handle. The text is biblical or devotional, and most likely a familiar passage. But the melody, that's where it gets complicated. If the chant uses early neumes, and most of the older ones do, you'll notice they don't tell you exactly what note to sing. Neumes show direction. They tell you whether the melody goes up or down, whether one note is followed by another, or if several should be sung quickly on the same syllable. But they don't tell you how far up or how far down. There's no pitch, no rhythm, no timing, unless the scribe used a staff. The staff, as we know it, didn't exist in early medieval manuscripts. That came later. But in the 11th century, a Benedictine monk named Guido of Arezzo introduced something close. 4 lines, fixed pitch, square notes. It wasn't universal right away, but where it caught on, it changed everything. If you're lucky, the manuscript you're reading uses that kind of notation. If not, you'll have to interpret, carefully, slowly. Compare it with other chants that do have staff lines. Look for melodic formulas, short musical phrases that show up across different chants. Many chants followed patterns. Not rigid, but familiar, the same way folk songs do. You begin to see it. You match a phrase in one chant to a similar one in another. You notice that the second neum always sits above the word domin in both. That's something. You find 4 versions of the same hymn in 4 manuscripts, each slightly different but clearly related. You map them side by side. You align the phrases. You look for consensus. Then you make a decision. You choose a melodic line that fits the most versions. You notate it. You sing it quietly at first. You adjust. Eventually, it starts to sound like something real, something old but still alive. Modern reconstructions rely on both manuscript evidence and performance tradition. You can't rely on the parchment alone. You have to understand how singers in that time would have phrased things, how they breathed, how they balanced long syllables and short ones. That's why most reconstructions are done in collaboration. Scholars, singers, paleographers, musicologists. No one person finds a chant. It's built piece by piece, voice by voice. There's a difference between recreating music and reinventing it. Good reconstruction doesn't aim to modernize. It doesn't add harmony or instrumentation that doesn't belong. It aims to get as close as possible to what a singer in, say, 1150 might have heard while standing in a stone nave at Matins. You'll never know exactly, but you can get close enough. Sometimes it's a matter of completing something half-finished. A manuscript may show the first verse with numes, then leave the rest unnotated. Why? Because the scribe expected the rest to be sung in the same pattern. They weren't writing for strangers 1,000 years in the future. They were writing for their choir, people who already knew the rules. So scholars step into that logic. They assume familiarity. They replicate the pattern. They try not to overthink it. If the first line rises and falls a certain way, the next line probably does too. If the cadence resolves on Amen, that same cadence likely returns every time. The challenge is knowing when to copy and when to question. Some scribes made mistakes. Others got creative. You have to stay alert, but also stay quiet. Then there's the performance side. Once the chant is reconstructed on paper, it has to be sung. That's the final test. Some reconstructions look good on the page, but feel wrong in the voice. The pacing stumbles. The phrasing clashes. The breath doesn't land where it should. So singers adjust. Slightly. Carefully. Respectfully. The goal is never perfection. The goal is to let the music breathe again. The first time you hear a fully reconstructed chant, it doesn't feel like discovery. It feels like return. The voice that sings it now is different, but the shape, the feeling, the reverence, that's the same. You're not recreating a museum piece. You're continuing a tradition that went silent for a while. And that's what makes it beautiful. Even today, new chants are still being reconstructed. Pages surface in libraries. Leaves once thought lost reappear. Fragments match fragments. Sometimes all it takes is one line, one phrase, one marginal note. From that, a whole piece can grow back. We don't get the full picture, but we get enough. Enough to hear how it might have sounded. Enough to sing it again. He didn't set out to change history. He just wanted his choir to stop making mistakes. That's how most revolutions begin. not with grand speeches or loud declarations, but with someone quietly trying to fix a small practical problem. Guido of Arezzo was a monk, a teacher. He lived in the early 11th century in what is now Italy. At the time, teaching music to a new group of singers took months, sometimes longer. Everything was passed down by ear. Melodies were remembered, not written, and memory was fragile. Guido saw this every day. He taught chant to young novices. He watched them struggle to recall long, winding melodies. And he realized something simple. The music wasn't the problem. The method was. So he designed a new way to write music down, a way to show clearly and reliably what to sing. It started with 4 lines. Before Guido, the symbols used in chant were floating shapes, numes, written above the text to show the general movement of the melody. They worked well enough if you already knew the tune. But they didn't tell you where to start. They didn't tell you the pitch or the distance between notes. Guido introduced a staff, 4 horizontal lines. Each line represented a specific pitch. He added a symbol at the beginning to anchor the notes, a reference point, a fixed position. For the first time in the West, music could be read the way we now think of reading it, from a page with clear structure, before ever hearing it sung. It wasn't just the staff. Guido also created a system of solmization, an early form of what we now know as do, re, mi. He used a hymn to St. John the Baptist as a teaching tool. Each line of the hymn began on a higher note, and from that, he named 6 tones: ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la. These syllables helped singers learn how to recognize and reproduce intervals, the space between notes. If that sounds familiar, it should. It's the root of solfège, the do-re-mi system still taught in schools, choirs, and conservatories around the world. What Guido offered wasn't just notation. It was a method, a system for teaching, a system for remembering, a system for transmitting music across space and time. It made things faster, more consistent, less dependent on oral memory. A chant could now be learned from a page. A melody could be preserved even if the teacher died. That changed everything. Guido wrote about his system in a treatise called the Micrologus. It spread quickly. Other monasteries adopted his ideas. Within a generation, notated music became more standardized. It didn't become perfect overnight. Some places resisted change. Old habits lingered. But the seed was planted. By the 12th and 13th centuries, more chants were written using staff lines. Notation evolved. Rhythms were added. Complex polyphony emerged. Music with multiple independent voices. None of that would have been possible without Guido's foundation. He didn't just invent a tool. He unlocked a new way of thinking about sound. We don't know much about Guido's life. He probably lived around 990 to 1050. He taught at the Benedictine Abbey of Pomposa and later worked in Arezzo, which gives him his name. He wasn't famous in his time, just respected, and then quietly foundational. It's easy to overlook figures like that. The ones who don't compose great works, the ones who don't perform. But without Guido, most of those great works wouldn't have been preserved, or even possible. I think about that sometimes when I hear a chant reconstructed from a medieval manuscript. How a note I'm hearing now, sung in a cathedral or played through a speaker, is only possible because one monk, 1,000 years ago, drew 4 lines on a page. We live in a world where sound can be captured instantly. A melody recorded in a bedroom can be uploaded, shared, archived, and retrieved from anywhere. But that world was made possible by people like Guido. People who worked slowly, carefully, quietly. People who believed that something as fleeting as music could, and should, be remembered. There's something comforting about that. The idea that a small change, a single new idea, can ripple through time and preserve what might otherwise be lost. That a monk, working alone in a scriptorium, trying to help his students, could invent a system that would shape every note we sing today. Even now, in the quiet corners of archives and rehearsal rooms, Guido's system is still at work. Singers trace melodies from ancient pages, following the same lines he drew centuries ago. They breathe where others breathed. They pause where others paused. And though the voices are new, the structure is the same. 4 lines, a fixed pitch, a way forward. What he left behind wasn't just a method. It was a map, not just for reading music, but for finding our way back to it. Once music could be written down, it could also carry something more. Not just sound, but voice. And few voices carried further than hers. She wasn't supposed to write music. She wasn't supposed to write anything at all. In the 12th century, women didn't publish theology. They didn't record visions. And they certainly didn't compose original chant. But Hildegard of Bingen did all 3. And unlike most voices from her time, especially female ones, hers was not only preserved, but heard again, centuries later. Her music doesn't sound like anyone else's. Even today, when you listen to her chants, you can feel the difference. They soar higher. They stay longer. Her melodies stretch beyond the usual phrases of Gregorian chant. Traditional chant stays grounded, structured, rooted in simple repeating tones. Hildegard's melodies rise, they float, they move like breath. Even if you don't know the language, even if you don't understand the theology, you can hear what she was reaching for. Light. Hildegard was born in 1098 in the Rhineland region of what is now Western Germany. As a child, she was given to the church, a common practice at the time. She was enclosed at the age of 8 to live a monastic life under the guidance of another woman named Jutta. Hildegard grew up behind walls, surrounded by stone, silence, and scripture. But silence didn't mean emptiness. She experienced visions from an early age, not fleeting images, but full sensory experiences she described as the living light. She saw them clearly, even when her eyes were closed. For years, she kept them to herself. In her 40s, she said the visions became too strong to ignore. She was told, in the vision themselves, to write them down. She hesitated. She didn't feel qualified. She was a woman, untrained in theology, unsure whether anyone would take her seriously. But with the support of her spiritual advisors and scribes, she began dictating what she saw. The result was a body of work unlike anything else in medieval Europe. 3 major visionary texts, letters to emperors and popes, scientific and medicinal writings, and music. Her chants were compiled into collections. The largest is called Symphonia Harmonia Celestium Revelationum, or Symphony of the Harmony of Celestial Revelations. Even the title tells you how she saw music, not just as performance, but as something divine, a harmony that reflected a higher order. She believed music brought people closer to God, that it was a form of spiritual alignment, not just prayer, resonance. Her chants reflect that. They aren't confined to the standard modes. They stretch beyond the expected range. Some leap a full octave, something almost unheard of in chant at the time. Her vocal lines are longer, more melodic, more expressive. And yet, they still feel like chant, just lifted. Despite her success, Hildegard didn't operate from a position of power in the way a bishop or abbot might have. She had to build her authority slowly, through vision, conviction, and persistence. She founded her own convent near Bingen on the Rhine River. She led a community of women. She preached, which was unusual. She corresponded with some of the most powerful men in Europe and held her ground. But after her death in 1179, her influence gradually faded. Her music wasn't widely copied outside her own community. It was preserved in a few manuscripts, precious but limited in reach. For centuries, her chants remained largely unknown, not erased, just dormant. They sat in archives, catalogued, occasionally mentioned, rarely sung. That began to change in the 20th century. Scholars began editing her texts. Musicologists transcribed her chants using modern notation. Performers started recording them, and audiences listened. Something in her music spoke across time. Not loudly, not urgently, just clearly. It didn't need to be updated or rearranged. It didn't need harmony or instrumentation. It stood on its own, raw, reverent, and still glowing with that sense of inner light. Today, Hildegard's music is some of the most widely performed chant from the medieval period. Her voice, written in a time when few women were even allowed to sing in public, now reaches listeners around the world. In cathedrals, in classrooms, in headphones. She's been called a mystic, a composer, a visionary, a scientist. But maybe more than any of that, she was a listener. She listened deeply to the world, to her own experience, to something beyond it. And she translated what she heard into music. Most chant was meant for ritual. Hildegard's feels more like reflection. It doesn't tell you what to feel. It just offers space. Space to pause, to listen, to notice. That's why it still resonates. Not because it's grand, but because it's personal. And in that way, it's timeless. Her chants survived in parchment for centuries. Now they live in voices, sung again slowly in rooms built to remember. That's how most medieval music reaches us now. Not through time machines, through people. People who read the old shapes on the page. People who rehearse the same lines again and again. People who sing not to perform, but to remember. It starts quietly. A singer opens a folio. A rehearsal room falls silent. A single line, maybe from Hildegard, maybe anonymous, is sung into the air. There's no harmony, no accompaniment, just one clean voice. And then another joins it, and then another. The room begins to fill, not with sound, with space. Most of what we know about medieval music today doesn't come from recordings. It comes from reconstructions, the careful work of people who dedicate their lives to early music. They start with a manuscript, sometimes a full chant, sometimes just a fragment, a few numes on a line, a prayer, a phrase. They translate the Latin, they read the notation, they cross-reference other manuscripts, checking for versions, variations, patterns. Then they write it out, using modern staff notation adapted from the original. It's not guesswork, but it is interpretation. You don't just read medieval music, you listen to it, even before it's sung. Once the music is prepared, it's handed to an ensemble. Early music, groups like Sequentia, the Tallis Scholars, or Anonymous Four specialize in chant and medieval vocal works. The singers understand how this music works, how it breathes, how it flows, how it stays simple. The goal isn't to embellish. The goal is to stay with it. Each note is treated with care. Each silence is honored. Some groups record in modern studios. Others travel to old cathedrals, not just for atmosphere, but for acoustics. Medieval chant was made for stone walls and high ceilings. A single note lingers for seconds. The building holds it up. That echo isn't an accident. It's part of the composition. When you sing in a cloister or a Romanesque chapel, you don't need to rush. The sound does the work for you. That's why this music moves slowly. It was made for places where time didn't need to be watched. Even in modern spaces, that same spirit is kept. Recordings are made late at night when traffic noise is gone. Engineers often use natural light and minimal equipment. The room matters. The quiet matters. Sometimes what's not heard becomes part of the music. The revival of medieval music didn't happen all at once. It began in the 19th century, when scholars started publishing editions of ancient manuscripts. In the 20th century, performers took interest and began to bring the pieces back into living sound. What began in archives is now in recordings, in playlists, in headphones, at once, ancient, and surprisingly at home in modern life. Many people listen without knowing the words. They don't need to. This music isn't about understanding every syllable. It's about surrendering to a slower rhythm, one that doesn't demand attention, it just allows it. Today, chant is used not just in churches, but in classrooms, in meditation rooms, in sleep therapy, even in film scores and ambient music. Its simplicity makes space for stillness. Even a single unaccompanied line can slow your thoughts. That's what makes it so timeless. Not complexity, but presence. And yet, it's still evolving. New manuscripts continue to surface. New recordings are made every year. Singers across the world are performing chants that were once forgotten. In Tokyo, in Oslo, in New York. All of it sung in Latin. All of it carrying memory. Not memory of events, but of ways of listening, of spaces that echo, of rooms that wait, of voices that don't rush to be heard. They just arrive. Some of the most beautiful moments in chant are the pauses, the in-between breaths, the rest after the line. That's what brings it closer to silence, and that's why it holds the ear. We often think of ancient music as dusty or stiff, but chant was always meant to be alive. Repetitive, yes. Simple, yes. But never cold. It was meant to move slowly, so it could move through you. That's how it works even now. Even in headphones. Even in a quiet room. Even as you fall asleep. These voices are not calling for you to follow. They're waiting for you to stop, to breathe, to listen. The rooms where medieval music is sung today may be filled with new voices, but they still carry echoes of the ones we almost didn't hear at all. Hildegard's name survived, but she wasn't the only one. She was rare, yes, but not alone. In convents across medieval Europe, women sang every day. They memorized chants, led worship. Sometimes they copied manuscripts, sometimes they composed. But most of their names are gone. Not erased maliciously, just quietly left out. Left in the margins, or never written down at all. When we talk about medieval music, most of what survived came from male monastic communities. Benedictines, Cistercians, Cluniacs. Their libraries were larger, their resources more stable, their books more often copied. But women's communities were active too. There were dozens, even hundreds of convents where women followed the same liturgical hours, sang the same chants, lived the same musical lives. The difference was in how those lives were documented, or how they weren't. In places like Essen, Gandersheim, and Rupertsberg, women not only participated in the musical life of the church, they shaped it. They trained young singers. They kept musical calendars. They preserved melodies. And in some cases, they composed original chants of their own. We know this because traces remain, just enough to suggest a fuller picture. One manuscript from the 12th century includes a series of chants labeled only with the initial B. No name, no biography, just the music. Another folio preserves a unique antiphon, used only in a small convent near Salzburg, found nowhere else. Was it written by a sister, a local tradition, a lost voice? We don't know. But someone wrote it. Someone taught it. Someone sang it long enough that it was copied into a book, and then time took over. Even when names did survive, they were rarely attached to music. A woman might be known as an abbess, or a visionary, or a patron, but her chants, if any, were anonymous. And in the world of chant, anonymity was common, even among men. The idea of authorship didn't function the same way it does now, but the effect was different. When men composed anonymously, they were still part of a documented system. Their work was folded into archives. When women did the same, their work often faded from view. Still, the music itself holds clues. Some chant melodies preserved in female houses use wider vocal ranges, suggesting they were written with women's voices in mind. Some local feast days, observed in nunneries, had special chants, composed for those events, and only for those events. They were personal, community-based, never intended for wide circulation, and so they stayed local, until the manuscripts were lost, or stored, or shelved and forgotten. In recent decades, musicologists have begun re-examining these sources, not just for their music, but for what they suggest about who was singing. Some researchers now focus specifically on female liturgical culture, trying to reconstruct not just what women sang, but what they created. Sometimes it's just one surviving folio. Sometimes it's an inventory list that mentions a chant book that no longer exists. Sometimes it's a letter, a request from one abbess to another, asking for a copy of a hymn. Clues, fragments, threads, enough to suggest a larger tapestry. Some convents developed musical traditions that lasted for generations. Essen Abbey was known for elaborate liturgies. Gandersheim produced several literate, educated women, including Hrotsvita, who wrote plays and possibly sacred poetry. We can't know how much music was lost, but we know that what survived was only a fraction. And yet, even a fraction is enough to suggest what might have been. Today, choirs and ensembles are performing chants that once lived only in these quieter corners. Not just Hildegard's, but anonymous pieces thought to come from women's communities. Carefully reconstructed, gently sung, not reimagined, just brought forward. Letting the voice speak again, even if we no longer know whose voice it was. It's easy to think of history as a story made of great names, but medieval music reminds us how much of it was collective. How many voices weren't preserved individually, but together in community, in ritual, in repetition. And how women, though rarely recorded, were never silent. They sang every day. We don't always need names to hear the presence of a voice. Sometimes the music itself is enough. A line remembered, a silence repeated, a song returning through someone new. But at some point, one line became two, and everything changed. For centuries, chant moved in a single voice. One line, one melody. No harmony, no chords. Just the shape of prayer, slow, clear even. But over time, singers began to listen differently. They started to hear what could happen if a second voice entered. Not in unison, not echoing, but weaving above or beneath the original. And what began as variation became a new way of making music. That shift from one line to many is what we now call polyphony. From the Greek, poly meaning many, and phonos meaning sound. It didn't arrive suddenly. It unfolded slowly, quietly, in places where people were already singing every day. In chapels, in choirs, in candle-lit rooms where chant still held the air. The earliest polyphony was called organum. One singer would hold the original chant, the vox principalis, while another added a second voice, called the vox organalis. At first, that second line just followed the main one, a few steps above or below, but soon it began to move more freely, pausing when the other continued, holding a note while the other passed. This was new, music with depth, with space between voices, and yet still sacred. Much of this early development happened in and around Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris in the 12th and 13th centuries. There, composers like Léonin and Peritin took the idea further. They layered 3, sometimes 4 voices together. Chants that had once flowed in a single thread now opened up like stained glass. The same words, but now with echo and lift and movement that never would have existed in plain chant. To listen to early polyphony is to hear time stretch. One voice may move slowly, holding long tones. Another may ripple above it in faster motion. You're no longer following a line. You're sitting inside a texture. It's not just melody, it's motion. The shift to polyphony changed how sacred spaces sounded and how people listened. Chant had trained ears to follow a single shape, a single mood, a single voice. Now there were tensions, resolutions, moments of suspension, where two lines seemed to hover before falling into agreement. Music became a kind of architecture, built from breath, held together by time. Not everyone welcomed the change. Some said it made the words harder to understand. Some said it distracted from the prayer. But it kept spreading, because it moved people. And because it made room for something chant alone could not. Musical storytelling. With polyphony, composers could shape drama. They could build tension, create contrast between voices, reflect emotion not just through lyrics, but through sound. By the late 13th century, polyphony had moved beyond the cloister. It was being sung in cathedrals, universities, courts. Composers began writing secular pieces using these same techniques. Love songs, laments, round dances. But it all began with chant. Every voice in polyphony, no matter how independent, was still tied to that first plain melody. The foundation, the through line, the memory. You can still hear it today. In a recording of Perotin's Videran Omnes, the bottom voice sings the original chant. Drawn out slowly, each syllable held for seconds. Above it, other voices leap and circle and glide. It's ancient and new at the same time. Structured but free. Sacred but full of movement. That's what polyphony did. It didn't replace chant. It expanded it. Made room for layers, for complexity, for harmony, for contrast. And in doing so, it brought medieval music closer to what we think of today, as a conversation between voices. All of it, still written by hand, still sung by breath, still carried in parchment and memory, but now with more voices. As the music grew more layered, so did the ways it could be felt, not just in cathedrals, but in memory, in silence, and eventually in sound that would never be sung at all. For a long time, medieval music lived almost entirely in voices. Monks sang chant. Nuns sang hymns. Choirs echoed through stone churches. Everything was built around the breath, around the line, around what the body could carry. But slowly, another kind of sound began to appear. Not made by lungs or lips, made by strings, by pipes, by wood and gut and air. Instruments weren't new. People had been playing simple flutes and drums for centuries. At feasts, in villages, in processions. But in the early Middle Ages, they had little place in sacred music. In fact, many church leaders saw them as distractions. Too worldly, too theatrical, too tied to dancing and celebration. Instruments were tools for entertainment. Voices were for prayer. But as music grew more complex, so did its tools. The earliest instruments used alongside chant were subtle, not soloists, but supporters. The psaltery, a kind of plucked zither, could add a quiet drone beneath the voice. The vielle, a bowed string instrument, and ancestor of the modern violin, could double the vocal line. And then there was the organ. Not the giant pipe organs of later centuries, but small portable ones. Air was pumped by hand. Keys were pressed with deliberate pressure. Even in its early form, the organ could sustain tones longer than a voice. It didn't replace chant. It underlined it, softly, respectfully. outside the monastery, instruments were more freely used. Traveling musicians, called minstrels or troubadours, sang songs accompanied by harps, lutes, and flutes. Their music was often secular. Love songs, political satire, dance tunes. They performed in courts, taverns, marketplaces. Theirs was a different kind of music, freer in form, more emotional in tone. But it shared something with sacred music. Repetition, memorization, and the desire to move people. As the boundaries between sacred and secular softened, so did the rules. By the 12th and 13th centuries, instruments began to appear more often in sacred settings. Not every cathedral accepted them, but some did, especially in processions and festivals, where visual splendor and sonic power went hand in hand. One of the most famous collections of medieval music, the Cantigas de Santa Maria, includes hundreds of songs praising the Virgin Mary. These songs were written with instrumental accompaniment in mind. The manuscripts even show images of the instruments themselves. Detailed drawings of lutes, rebecks, portative organs, and frame drums. This wasn't improvisation. It was a musical language that had grown large enough to include more than voices. Instruments also helped carry music across distances. A voice fades quickly in open air, but a pipe or a bell can ring across a field. That made instruments especially valuable in outdoor rituals, pilgrimages, and processional music. They weren't just decoration, they were reach. Still, many instruments didn't survive physically. Wood decays. Gut strings snap. What we know comes mostly from paintings, carvings, and descriptions in old texts. We piece them together the same way we do music, slowly, carefully, with respect for what can't be recovered. But what has survived tells us something clear. The medieval soundscape was more varied than we often imagine. It wasn't just solemn chant in stone chapels. It was also pipes in the street, horns in the square, lutes in quiet corners, a tapestry of tones. Some instruments were considered refined, others were not. The lute was noble. The hurdy-gurdy, a strange cranked instrument with droning strings, was often seen as rustic. Drums could be celebratory or vulgar, depending on context. But over time, these distinctions softened, because people responded to sound. Not just structure, not just words, but sound. In sacred music, the human voice still held the highest place, but instruments found their way in, gently, then firmly. They offered color, volume, contrast, support, and in doing so, they helped shape the next phase of music, one that would eventually give rise to orchestras, concert halls, and written scores for every part. But in the beginning, they were simple, plucked, bowed, struck, held in the hands of musicians who weren't always named, played in spaces that didn't always echo, but remembered in image and rhythm, and slowly restored today. Instruments added color to the sacred, but soon, music would reach beyond the church entirely, into taverns, towers, and the open air, where melody served memory and story lived in sound. Not all medieval music was prayer. Not all songs were meant to echo in stone chapels. Some were sung outdoors, on balconies, in gardens, around long wooden tables lit by firelight. They were songs for company, songs for memory, songs for the living. By the 11th and 12th centuries, a new kind of musician had begun to appear, one who wasn't part of the church, but still lived by song. They were called troubadours in the south of France, trouvères in the north, minnesingers in Germany. Different names, but a similar role. Poets and composers, often of noble birth, who travelled from court to court performing verses of love, loyalty, humour and loss. Their songs weren't sacred, but they were still structured. Often sung solo with soft accompaniment from a lute, harp or vielle, these pieces followed clear melodic patterns. Verse, refrain, verse. Music that could be remembered. Shared, passed along. The themes were often romantic. Idealized love, distant admiration, emotional restraint. Not physical love, emotional longing. A knight yearning for a lady far above his station. A poet praising someone he could never reach. It was called courtly love. And it shaped not only music, but literature, chivalry, and storytelling for centuries. But not all songs were soft or noble. Some were sharp, satirical, even subversive. There were jongleurs, more like entertainers than nobles, who performed in the streets, singing about local news, political tension, or everyday life. Their songs weren't written down as carefully, but they were remembered, sung again and again, because they were true, because they made people laugh, or feel, or think. Few of these songs survive in full, but some manuscripts remain. One of the largest collections is the Carmina Burana, over 200 texts, written in Latin and Middle High German. They cover everything from drinking songs to moral lessons to bawdy humour. In the 20th century, composer Karl Orff set some of them to music in a famous orchestral work. But the original melodies were simpler, fewer instruments, fewer dynamics, just voice and rhythm, and a world behind every word. For many of these performers, music was also a form of news. There were no newspapers, no radio. So traveling musicians carried stories. Songs passed between cities. Melodies adapted to local languages. Verses rewritten to reflect new kings, lost battles, or public grief. They were living archives, sung from memory, passed without parchment. Some troubadours wrote dozens of songs in their lifetime. Others wrote one or two, then vanished from the record. A few were women. The Trobairites of Occitania left behind a small number of lyrics, many centered on female perspectives, agency, and emotion. As with sacred music, their work was preserved unevenly. But it remains. Enough to remind us, women sang about love too, and they didn't always wait to be the object of someone else's verse. These secular traditions didn't stay separate from sacred music forever. They influenced each other. Melodies crossed over, instruments moved between spaces, and eventually, the structure of secular songs helped shape later developments in harmony and composition. But for a time, this music stood on its own. Not holy, not heretical, just human. Songs for the body, for the mind, for the heart. They weren't always written down, but they were rarely forgotten, because someone always remembered the tune, and someone else always remembered the words. As songs moved from sacred walls to public squares, music began to change shape. not just in purpose, but in form. And slowly the rules themselves began to shift. In the beginning, music moved freely. Chant had no beat. Just breathe. A long line of sound shaped by the phrasing of the text and the patience of the singer. There was no need to count, only to follow. But by the late Middle Ages, that began to change. Music was growing more layered. Voices moved in harmony. Instruments joined in. Composers began to realize if the notes were going to fit together, they had to happen in time, not just in tone, in rhythm. It started with a symbol, a dot, a line, a shape that meant a sound should be held or shortened. They called it mensural notation, from the Latin mensura, meaning measure. For the first time, music could be notated not only for pitch, but for duration. It was a shift in thinking, not just how music sounded, but how it moved. Now it could be planned, balanced, built. A composer could decide how voices would align, not by memory, not by chance, but by design. This is when we begin to see names. Not just scribes, but composers. People known for writing specific pieces of music in specific rhythmic patterns for specific ensembles. People like Guillaume de Machaut in France, Francesco Landini in Italy, Philippe de Vitry, who helped codify rhythmic modes. Patterns of short and long notes like early time signatures. Their music survives, not just in fragments, but in books, bound, preserved, readable. These new notations use different shapes for different note lengths, long breve, semi-breve. Eventually, those became the foundation for the note values we still use today. Quarter note, eighth note, half. It began here, in pages of parchment, ink, and intention. The change wasn't immediate. Free chants still lived in monasteries. Oral songs still passed through taverns and towns. But alongside them, something new was forming, written rhythm, and with it, the possibility of music that could be repeated exactly, across space, across time. Now, multiple singers could follow a score. Not just by ear, but by eye. This allowed for greater complexity. Not just polyphony, but counterpoint, where voices moved in contrast, rhythmically independent, but harmonically aware. Music became more than shared breath. It became a kind of architecture, measured, repeatable, a structure of sound that could be rebuilt again and again. This is also when we begin to hear music as expression, not just devotion. Love songs with clear meters, sacred pieces with rhythmic propulsion. Music could now reflect not just theology, but emotion, joy, sorrow, wonder. It had the tools to shape a feeling over time, because it could be measured. Even silence changed. It was no longer just a pause. It became a rest, a defined intentional space between sounds. Written, counted. The space was now part of the plan. And in this shift, from breath to beat, from memory to manuscript, music crossed a threshold. It became something we could return to, not just remember, not just recreate, but read. That's what survived. Not the performances, not the voices, but the pages, the symbols, the systems. It's why we can still hear music from the 14th century, not as guesswork, but as sound restored. A line on a staff, a note that lasts one beat, another that lasts two, and all of it leading toward what came next. Renaissance polyphony, Baroque ornament, classical balance, a history of music that built itself on the ability to count. But here, at the end of the Middle Ages, the shape was already there. A melody, a rhythm, a composer's hand on parchment, telling us not just what to sing, but when. If you enjoyed this story, and if history told softly helps you wind down, stick with us. You're listening to The Historical Sleeper, where music, memory, and quiet stories from the past help you fall gently into rest. We release new sleep stories regularly. Always real history, never loud, always made to calm, not clutter. So, if that's something you want more of, follow, like, or subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep making stories like this, and it helps others find them too. We'll see you next time. But for now, just breathe and rest.